Red light filled the bridge of the scout ship as every alarm on board screamed at once. Commander Selthara gripped the edge of her console as the ship shuddered violently, thrown sideways by a wall of radiation pouring off a small blue planet ahead. Her navigator, a young officer named Dren, stared at his screen in disbelief, his hands frozen above the controls. "Pull us back," Selthara ordered. "Now." The ship's engines groaned as it reversed away from the blue and green world spinning quietly below them. On the main screen, a single word flashed over and over in bright red letters: Class X hostile, the most dangerous rating a planet could receive in the entire Kryvax database, a rating given to fewer than a dozen worlds in the galaxy's history, and every single one of them was empty. Lifeless. Places where nothing survived long enough to matter. Dren's voice shook as he read the sensor data aloud. Surface temperature swings of over 60 degrees between regions. 70% of the surface is covered in corrosive liquid. The atmosphere is 20% reactive oxygen. That's enough to combust on contact with a single spark. There are 17 active tectonic plates grinding against each other, volcanic eruptions detected on 4 continents, and radiation storms cycling through the upper atmosphere every 11 years. Selthara felt her stomach tighten. She had flown through asteroid fields, navigated collapsing stars, and once guided her ship through the tail of a rogue comet. None of it compared to what she was looking at now. This was not a dangerous planet. This was a planet built to kill anything that dared to land on it. "Send the order," she said quietly. "Full retreat. Mark this system as forbidden, and move on." But before Dren could type the command, a new sound broke through the alarms. A steady, rhythmic pulse. Not random noise. Not the chaotic static of a storm, or the crackle of solar wind. This was structured, patterned, deliberate. "Commander," Dren whispered, "that's a signal." Selthara turned slowly back toward the screen. "A signal from where?" "The surface," Dren said. "It's coming from the surface." The bridge fell silent, except for the low hum of the ship's engines. Every officer turned to look at their commander, waiting for her to give the order to leave, to abandon this deadly world and never return. That was protocol. That was what centuries of survey missions had trained them to do, the moment a planet was marked Class X. Instead, Selthara stared at the blinking signal on the screen, her mind racing. No creature should be able to survive down there, let alone build something advanced enough to broadcast a structured radio wave into space. It didn't make sense. Nothing about this planet made sense. "Bring us back into orbit," she said, slowly. "Keep our distance from the radiation belts. I want to know what's making that sound." Dren hesitated, his hand hovering over the controls. "Commander, with respect, our protocols are clear. Class X worlds are to be avoided entirely. We are not equipped for this." "I'm aware of the protocols," Selthara said, her voice calm but firm. "I wrote 3 of them myself. But protocols were built on the assumption that nothing could live down there. If something is sending a signal, then something is alive. And I want to know what kind of creature could possibly survive a planet like this." The ship eased back into a higher, safer orbit, far above the radiation storms, but close enough for their instruments to scan the surface in detail. What they found over the next several hours defied everything they thought they understood about survivable worlds. Cities. Not caves carved into the safest corners of the planet, not scattered shelters hidden from the worst of the storms. Cities. Sprawling. Lit up. Humming with electricity. Spread across every kind of terrain imaginable. Structures stood tall in scorching deserts, where the sand itself would blister unprotected skin. Towns clustered along coastlines battered by storms strong enough to tear apart lesser ships. Entire populations lived within sight of mountains that spewed fire and ash into the sky. "This isn't possible," Dren murmured, flipping through image after image. "Look at this one. It's built right at the base of an active volcano. And this one, right along a fault line that shows constant earthquake activity. Whoever built these either doesn't understand the danger, or they don't care," Selthara finished. She leaned closer to the screen, studying a cluster of lights along a jagged coastline. The waves crashing against the shore were massive, powerful enough to crush stone, yet the structures stood firm, built to withstand exactly that kind of force. This wasn't recklessness. This was preparation. Whatever lived down there hadn't stumbled onto this planet by accident and failed to notice the danger. They had studied it, measured it, built around it. Pull up historical records, Selthara said. Every species that has attempted to settle on a world with even half this level of hostility. I want comparisons. Dren's fingers moved quickly across his console, and a long list appeared on the screen. Species after species, each one a tragic entry in the Kryvax archives. The Voth colonists who had tried to settle a moderately unstable world 3 centuries earlier, wiped out within 2 generations by a single volcanic winter. The Ithrans, a resilient aquatic species, who had attempted to adapt to a planet with unpredictable tides, only to vanish entirely when a single massive storm system altered the planet's rotation. Every entry ended the same way: extinction, failure, silence. None of them lasted more than a few hundred years, Dren said, his voice barely above a whisper, and none of the worlds they tried to settle were anywhere near this dangerous. Selthara straightened, her eyes fixed on the pulsing signal still broadcasting steadily from the surface below. Whatever species called this planet home hadn't just survived, they had thrived. They had built cities, developed technology advanced enough to reach into space, and done it all while living on top of a world that, by every measure the Kryvax had ever recorded, should have killed them within a single generation. "Commander," Dren said slowly, "what are we looking at down there?" Selthara didn't answer right away. She kept her eyes on the screen, on the tiny lights scattered across a planet that shouldn't have allowed anything to live on its surface at all, let alone flourish. "I don't know," she finally said, "but I intend to find out." She turned to her communications officer, a steady and quiet woman named Ashen, who had said nothing throughout the entire ordeal, simply watching, listening, recording everything for the official log. "Prepare a full report for the Dominion Council," Selthara said. "Tell them we've found something they need to see for themselves." Ashen nodded and began typing, her expression unreadable. Selthara turned back to the main viewport, staring down at the blue and green planet spinning peacefully below them, utterly unaware that it was being watched, studied, and questioned by visitors who could not comprehend how anything had managed to survive there at all. Somewhere far beneath the clouds, oceans, and shifting continents, an entire species was going about its day, farming, building, arguing over small things, falling asleep in houses built along coastlines that could, at any moment, be swallowed by the very waves crashing against their shores. They had no idea a ship was hovering above them. They had no idea that, for the first time in recorded Kryvax history, a Class X hostile world had just become the most important discovery in the galaxy. Selthara closed her eyes for a moment, trying to process what she had just witnessed. Every instinct told her to leave, to follow protocol, to mark the planet as forbidden and move on to safer skies. But something else, something she couldn't quite name, told her to stay, to watch, to understand. Because whatever was living down there had done something no other species in the galaxy had ever managed to do. They had made peace with a planet built to destroy them, and Selthara intended to learn exactly how. 3 days passed before Selthara gave the order to descend closer, and in those 3 days, the ship's small crew watched the planet below with a mixture of fear and fascination that none of them could shake. They named it privately among themselves, since the structured signal they had intercepted turned out to be a language none of their translation systems could decode on the first attempt. The inhabitants called their world Earth, a name that seemed almost too simple for a planet so violent and so alive at the same time. Selthara spent most of those 3 days in the observation deck, watching storm systems roll across entire continents on the main view screen. She watched a hurricane larger than some small moons form over an ocean, spin for 9 days, and finally break apart against a coastline lined with structures that had clearly been built to survive exactly this kind of event. She watched lightning storms light up the night side of the planet like scattered fireworks, thousands of strikes per hour, each one capable of ending a life in an instant. And through it all, the lights of human cities never went dark. They flickered sometimes, dimmed during the worst of the storms, but they always came back. "I've been reviewing the historical archive you requested," Ashen said one evening, joining Selthara at the viewport with a datapad in hand. "I found something you should see." "Show me," Selthara said. Ashen pulled up a comparison chart, listing every species the Kryvax Dominion had ever recorded attempting to settle on a hostile world. Beside each entry was a survival timeline, showing how long the species had lasted before their population collapsed, or the settlement was abandoned entirely. The Voth colony lasted 41 years, Ashen said. The Ithrans lasted just under 200, and that was considered a remarkable achievement at the time. The Grethic expedition to the ice world of Corvin 9 lasted only 6 years before the entire colony was lost to a single unexpected storm. And this planet? Selthara asked, though she already suspected the answer. Ashen hesitated before pulling up another chart, one that stretched much further back in time than any of the others. Based on the geological layers we've scanned, and the architectural patterns across different regions, this species appears to have inhabited Earth for at least 200,000 years, possibly longer. Selthara felt a chill run through her. 200,000 years on a planet that, by every scientific measure her people had ever developed, should have been utterly uninhabitable. It wasn't just survival, it was something far beyond that. How is that possible? She asked quietly, more to herself than to Ashen. I don't have an answer yet, Ashen admitted, but I have a theory, if you're willing to hear it. Selthara nodded, gesturing for her to continue. Every other species we've recorded approached hostile worlds the same way, Ashen said. They searched for the safest possible location, built their settlements there, and did everything they could to avoid the planet's dangers entirely. They treated the environment as an enemy to be avoided at all costs. But these beings, she gestured toward the screen, toward the storm-battered coastlines and the cities built beside volcanoes. They don't seem to avoid the danger at all. They build directly into it. They study it. They seem to expect it, and they prepare for it long before it arrives. Selthara turned this idea over in her mind, watching a cluster of city lights near a particularly active fault line pulse steadily through the night, undisturbed by the tremors her sensors had recorded just hours earlier. You're saying they don't survive by avoiding the danger, she said slowly. You're saying they survive by expecting it. That's my theory, Ashen said, but there's something else, something stranger. She pulled up a new set of images, this time showing individual humans rather than cities or landscapes. In one image, a group of people stood at the edge of a churning ocean during what her sensors identified as a violent storm, and instead of running for shelter, they appeared to be watching it, some of them even recording it with small handheld devices. In another image, a single figure stood near the rim of an active volcanic vent, close enough that the heat alone should have been unbearable, studying the ground with focused interest. They're not just tolerating the danger, Ashen said. In some cases, they appear to be seeking it out deliberately. Selthara stared at the images for a long moment, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. On every world the Kryvax had ever studied, danger was something to be avoided, feared, and escaped from as quickly as possible. It was the most basic instinct shared across every intelligent species they had ever encountered. Yet here, on a planet more dangerous than any other in recorded history, some of these creatures appeared to be running directly toward the very things that should have killed them. Prepare a full sensor sweep of that research outpost, Selthara said, pointing to a small cluster of buildings near the edge of a frozen, storm-battered coastline. According to their scans, it was one of the more remote human settlements, isolated enough that any contact could be handled with minimal risk of triggering a wider panic. I want detailed readings on everyone inside. Biological data, structural integrity of the buildings, everything. You're considering direct contact, Ashen said. It wasn't a question. I am, Selthara admitted. I know it goes against every protocol we have for a Class X world, but I've never seen anything like this before, and I doubt anyone in the Dominion has either. If we leave now, we walk away from the most important discovery of the century. Dren, who had been quietly listening from his station, finally spoke up, his voice tight with concern. Commander, with all due respect, we still don't understand what these creatures are capable of. We don't know if they're peaceful. We don't know if their technology is more advanced than ours. We've assumed they're primitive because their radio signals are relatively simple, but a species that can survive on a planet like this for 200,000 years might be far more dangerous than anything we've prepared for. Selthara considered his words carefully. He wasn't wrong to be cautious. Every lesson her people had learned about first contact emphasized patience, distance, and careful observation before any direct interaction was attempted. But something about this situation felt different. The signal they'd first detected wasn't a threat. It wasn't a weapon powering up or a defense system activating. It was simple, structured communication, almost like a conversation being broadcast into the emptiness of space, without any real expectation that someone might be listening. "We'll proceed carefully," Selthara said. "A single diplomatic pod, minimal crew, full defensive shielding, and constant contact with the ship. If anything goes wrong, we pull back immediately." Dren nodded reluctantly, clearly still uneasy, but unwilling to argue further with his commander's decision. Over the following 2 days, the ship's sensors gathered as much information as possible about the chosen research outpost. It sat near the edge of a rugged volcanic island, surrounded by glaciers on one side and steaming geothermal vents on the other, an environment so extreme that Selthara found it difficult to imagine anyone choosing to live there voluntarily. Yet the scans showed a small, steady population moving in and out of the buildings each day, seemingly unbothered by the freezing winds or the occasional tremor shaking the ground beneath their feet. "Their vital signs are stable," Ashen reported, reviewing the latest scan results. "Body temperature regulation appears remarkably efficient given the surrounding conditions. Stress indicators are minimal, even during periods of increased seismic activity." "They're not afraid," Selthara murmured, watching a small group of humans walk casually past a steaming vent that her own sensors flagged as dangerously unstable. "Either that," Ashen said, "or they've simply learned not to show it." Selthara couldn't decide which possibility unsettled her more. On the morning of their planned contact, the crew gathered in the launch bay, preparing the small diplomatic pod for descent. Selthara stood at the center of the room, going over the mission parameters one final time with her small team. Dren would pilot the pod, Ashen would handle communications and translation, and Selthara herself would lead the initial contact, following protocols that had been refined over centuries of careful, cautious diplomacy with dozens of other species across the galaxy. None of those protocols, she knew, had ever been tested against a species that lived willingly on the most dangerous planet in recorded history. "Remember," she told her team as they boarded the pod, "we are guests here, not conquerors. We observe, we learn. We do not assume anything about their capabilities or intentions until we have clear evidence." The pod's engines hummed to life, and slowly, carefully, they began their descent toward the swirling clouds of Earth's atmosphere, toward the storm-battered island, where a small group of ordinary humans were about to become the first of their species to knowingly meet visitors from beyond their world. Selthara gripped the edge of her seat as the pod shuddered violently upon entering the atmosphere, buffeted by winds far stronger than her instruments had predicted. Outside the viewport, the sky churned with dark clouds, streaked with flashes of lightning that lit up the cabin in brief, blinding bursts. "Turbulence levels rising," Dren called out, fighting to keep the pod steady. "This atmosphere is far more volatile than our readings suggested." "Hold steady," Selthara said, watching the storm rage outside the viewport with a strange mixture of terror and awe. Somewhere below them, in the middle of this very storm, an entire species had built their homes, raised their children, and lived out their lives for thousands of generations, without ever knowing a moment of true safety. And yet, according to every scan they had gathered, those same people were, at this very moment, going about their ordinary routines, as if the storm outside were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Selthara took a slow breath, steadying her nerves as the pod broke through the lowest layer of clouds, revealing the jagged, storm-battered coastline of the research outpost ahead. Whatever they were about to find down there, she knew, was about to change everything her people thought they understood about survival. The pod touched down hard on a stretch of black volcanic rock, sliding several feet before coming to a stop, just short of a steep ridge overlooking the sea. Selthara braced herself against her seat as the landing gear absorbed the impact, and for a long moment, no one inside the pod moved or spoke. Outside, the wind howled against the hull, carrying with it a fine mist of freezing rain that streaked across the small viewport. Through the haze, Selthara could just make out the shape of a low, sturdy building a short distance away. its windows glowing warm and yellow against the gray, storm-darkened landscape. "Life signs detected inside the structure," Ashen reported, her voice steady despite the tension in the cabin. "6 individuals. Vital signs stable. No signs of alarm." "They haven't noticed us yet," Dren said, glancing at the sensor readout. Selthara unbuckled herself from her seat and moved toward the small viewport, watching the storm rage outside with a growing sense of unease. Every instinct told her this was reckless, that stepping outside into weather her own instruments classified as dangerously unstable was the kind of decision that ended missions in disaster. But she had come too far to turn back now. "Prepare the outer hatch," she said. "We proceed as planned." The hatch hissed open, and immediately the cabin filled with the roar of the storm, wind slicing through the opening with enough force to rock the entire pod on its landing gear. Selthara stepped forward first, her environmental suit humming to life around her, adjusting instantly to the harsh conditions outside. Even through the suit's protective layers, she could feel the raw power of the wind pressing against her, could hear the distant crash of waves against the rocky shore below. Ashen and Dren followed close behind, both of them visibly tense as they made their way across the uneven volcanic terrain toward the glowing building ahead. Selthara kept her pace steady, deliberate, trying to project calm confidence despite the storm raging around them and the uncertainty of what awaited them inside. They were still several paces from the building's entrance when the door suddenly swung open, spilling warm light out into the storm. A figure stepped into the doorway, silhouetted against the glow from within, and for a brief, frozen moment, both parties simply stared at one another, across the short distance separating them. The human was tall, wrapped in a thick, weatherproof coat, with short dark hair plastered to her forehead by the freezing rain. She held a mug in one hand, steam still rising faintly from its contents despite the wind, and her expression shifted rapidly from mild curiosity to complete, stunned disbelief as she took in the sight of 3 unfamiliar figures standing on the rocks outside her research station. "Daniel," the woman called back into the building, her voice carrying clearly over the wind, remarkably steady given the circumstances. "You need to come see this." A second figure appeared behind her, a broad-shouldered man with a neatly trimmed beard, who froze mid-step the moment his eyes landed on the visitors, standing just beyond the doorway. For several long seconds no one moved. The storm continued to rage around them, indifferent to the historic moment unfolding on that small, rocky island. Selthara raised one hand slowly, palm open, a gesture she hoped would translate across species as a sign of peaceful intent. Beside her, Ashen activated the small translation device attached to her suit, hoping their limited analysis of human language, gathered from days of intercepted broadcasts, would be enough to form a basic greeting. "We mean no harm," Ashen said carefully, the device translating her words into a rough approximation of the local human language. "We have come from beyond your world. We wish only to speak with you." The woman in the doorway blinked, glancing briefly at her companion, before looking back at the 3 visitors standing in the storm. To Selthara's astonishment, rather than panic or flee, the woman simply let out a short, disbelieving laugh, shaking her head slowly. "Right," she said, setting her mug down on a nearby ledge. "Okay, sure. Why not? Come on in before you all freeze." She stepped back, holding the door open wide despite the wind trying to tear it from her grip, gesturing for the visitors to come inside, as though she were welcoming unexpected guests, rather than beings from another world entirely. Selthara exchanged a brief glance with Ashen and Dren, both of whom looked as thoroughly confused by the reaction as she felt. This was not the response any of their protocols had prepared them for. There was no panic, no immediate call for help, no visible fear at all. Just calm, practical hospitality in the face of the impossible. They stepped inside, and the warmth of the building hit Selthara immediately, a welcome relief after the biting cold outside. The room was simple, filled with scientific equipment, maps pinned to the walls, and the comforting smell of something warm cooking on a small stove in the corner. 4 other humans sat scattered around the room, all of them now staring openly at the visitors, though none of them appeared to be in any immediate danger of panicking. "Okay," the bearded man, Daniel, said slowly, running a hand through his hair as he studied the 3 visitors carefully. "I feel like I should be more scared right now, But honestly, we've had weirder mornings out here. Weirder than this? Dren asked, his translated voice carrying a note of genuine disbelief. Last month, a chunk of glacier the size of a house calved off right next to our equipment shed, said a woman sitting near the stove, her attention barely leaving the instrument panel in front of her, even as she spoke. Nearly took Peter's arm off. This is comparatively tame. The man apparently named Peter, seated nearby with a bandage still visible around one forearm, gave a small, dismissive wave. Barely grazed me. Selthara found herself momentarily speechless, watching this small group of humans react to what should have been the most significant, terrifying event of their lives, with the same casual indifference they might show toward an unexpected change in the weather forecast. "You are not afraid of us," Selthara said carefully, her translated words hanging in the air of the small room. The first woman, the one who had answered the door, tilted her head slightly, considering the question. "Should we be?" "We do not know," Selthara admitted honestly. "We have traveled a great distance. We did not expect to be invited inside so easily." "Well," the woman said, pulling out a chair and gesturing for Selthara to sit. "You didn't come down here shooting at us, and you seem more curious than anything else. Around here, that's usually enough to earn a cup of tea and a seat by the fire." Introductions followed slowly, carefully, as both sides worked to bridge the gap between their languages and their understanding of one another. The woman who had first opened the door introduced herself as Grace, the lead researcher at the small outpost, and one by one, the others introduced themselves as well. Daniel, the bearded man who studied the island's volcanic activity. Peter, still nursing his bandaged arm, who monitored the glacier's movement. A quiet, sharp-eyed woman named Ellen, who tracked seismic activity across the region. A younger man named Oliver, who managed the station's power and communication systems. And finally, a soft-spoken woman named Sophie, who spent her days studying the storm systems that regularly battered the coastline. As the humans settled back into their routines, seemingly unbothered by the presence of their unexpected guests, Selthara found herself watching them with growing fascination. Every so often, the entire building would shudder slightly, a subtle vibration passing through the floor, and none of the humans so much as glanced up from their work. "That was an earthquake," Ashen said quietly, checking her readings. "A minor one, but still." "We get those a few times a week out here," Grace said, overhearing the comment as she poured hot water into a row of mismatched mugs. "You get used to it. Well, not used to it exactly. You just learn to live alongside it." "How?" Selthara asked, genuinely curious. "How does one learn to live alongside something so unpredictable, so capable of destroying everything you've built?" Grace paused, considering the question seriously, for the first time since the visitors had arrived. She set down the kettle and leaned against the counter, folding her arms thoughtfully. "I suppose," she said slowly, "you just accept pretty early on that you don't get to control the ground beneath your feet. The ocean's going to do what it wants. The volcano's going to do what it wants. All you can really control is how prepared you are when something does happen, and how quickly you help each other afterward. But you build your homes here anyway," Selthara said. "You choose to live in the most dangerous places on your planet, when safer locations must surely exist elsewhere." Daniel, who had been listening from across the room, let out a short laugh. "Someone has to study this stuff. Besides, the world's not exactly short on danger, no matter where you go. Might as well pick the spot that actually teaches you something." Selthara turned this idea over carefully in her mind, watching the small group continue their work around her, utterly unbothered by the tremors, the storm still raging outside, or the presence of visitors from another world entirely. It was a mindset entirely foreign to everything her people had built their survival strategies around, and yet, staring at the calm, practical faces of the humans in that small research station, she found herself beginning to understand. They didn't survive this planet by avoiding its dangers. They survived it by refusing to let those dangers control how they lived. Outside, the storm showed no signs of slowing, wind screaming against the windows, waves crashing violently against the rocky shore below. And inside, 6 humans continued about their evening as though nothing unusual had happened at all, sharing tea and quiet conversation with 3 visitors from a world none of them had ever imagined they would live to see. Selthara accepted the warm mug Grace offered her, wrapping both hands around it, still trying to process everything she had witnessed since stepping through that door. Whatever she had expected to find when she first detected that structured signal from orbit, it certainly hadn't been this. Calm, ordinary people, living calm, ordinary lives, on top of the single deadliest planet the Kryvax Dominion had ever recorded. And somehow, impossibly, they made it look easy. The tremor started small, barely more than a light shiver beneath the floorboards, easy enough to dismiss, as another one of the minor quakes the researchers had already grown accustomed to. But then it grew stronger, and stronger still, until the mugs on the table began to rattle, and a low, deep groan echoed up from somewhere far beneath the island itself. Ellen was on her feet instantly, eyes locked on the seismic readout glowing on her monitor. "That's not one of our usual quakes," she said sharply, her calm demeanor shifting into focused urgency. "Magnitudes climbing fast. This is coming from the vent system." Sophie was already moving toward the window, pulling back the curtain to peer out into the storm-darkened night. Steam pressure on the eastern ridge just spiked. If that vent blows, we're looking at a proper eruption, not just venting. Selthara felt her pulse quicken, every instinct urging her to retreat immediately back toward the pod, back toward the relative safety of orbit. But the humans around her, rather than scrambling in panic, moved with brisk, practiced efficiency, each of them falling into a role they had clearly rehearsed many times before. "Oliver, cut the main power line to the east wing and switch us to backup," Grace called out, already pulling on a heavier coat near the door. "Daniel, grab the seismic kit. We need live readings from the ridge. Peter, radio the coastal station and get everyone off the lower beach, now." The room transformed within seconds. Calm conversation replaced by swift, coordinated action. No one shouted. No one froze. Selthara watched, stunned, as the small team moved with the precision of a crew that had drilled for this exact scenario dozens of times before, each person trusting the others to handle their part without hesitation. "You should return to your ship," Grace said, glancing briefly at Selthara as she zipped up her coat. "This could get dangerous fast, and I won't have that on my conscience." "What will you do?" Selthara asked, unable to hide the alarm in her translated voice. "Our jobs," Grace said simply, pulling open the door as another tremor rattled the building around them. "Make sure everyone gets clear, gather what data we can, and keep the station standing if we're able. It's what we're here for." Selthara hesitated only a moment before making a decision that went against every instinct her training had drilled into her. "We're coming with you." Grace paused, clearly surprised, but there was no time to argue. "Suit yourselves, stay close, and do exactly what I say." Outside, the night had turned violent. The wind howled louder than before, carrying with it a faint, acrid smell of sulfur that grew stronger with every passing second. In the distance, along the ridge overlooking the sea, a faint orange glow had begun to flicker against the low clouds, growing brighter with each heartbeat. Daniel moved quickly across the rocky terrain, seismic equipment slung over one shoulder, calling out readings to Ellen, who followed close behind with a portable monitor strapped to her wrist. Sophie had already climbed into a rugged all-terrain vehicle parked near the station, its engine roaring to life despite the fierce wind buffeting against it. "Get in!" she called to Selthara and the others, waving them toward the vehicle. "We need to reach the coastal families before that vent decides what it's going to do." Selthara climbed in without hesitation, Ashen and Dren following close behind, all three of them gripping the sides of the vehicle tightly as Sophie steered them down a narrow, winding path toward the shoreline below. Through the rain-streaked window, Selthara watched the orange glow along the ridge grow steadily brighter, pulsing now with an ominous, rhythmic intensity. "Is this normal?" Dren asked, his translated voice tight with barely controlled fear. "Normal enough that we have a plan for it," Sophie called back over the roar of the engine and the storm. "Doesn't mean it isn't dangerous, just means we've thought about what to do when it happens." They reached the small cluster of coastal buildings within minutes, and Sophie was out of the vehicle before it had fully stopped, sprinting toward the nearest structure and pounding on the door. Within moments, families began emerging, bundled against the cold, moving quickly but calmly toward higher ground, as Sophie directed them with clear, steady instructions. Selthara stepped out of the vehicle, watching the scene unfold with a growing sense of awe. There was no panic here, no chaos, despite the very real danger glowing brighter along the ridge with every passing minute. Parents guided children by the hand, neighbors helped elderly residents navigate the uneven terrain, and every single person moved with a quiet, practiced determination that spoke of countless drills and a deep, ingrained understanding that this moment, however frightening, was simply part of living on this island. A sudden, deep boom echoed across the landscape, and the orange glow along the ridge flared brilliantly bright, illuminating the storm clouds from beneath in a way Selthara had never witnessed before. A fine mist of ash began drifting down through the rain, and somewhere behind her, she heard Ellen's voice crackle through a small radio device. "Vents active, but it's a minor eruption, nothing catastrophic. Ash and steam, no significant lava flow toward the coast. Repeat, no immediate danger to the lower settlements." Sophie let out a visible breath of relief, turning back toward the families still gathered nearby. "All right, we'll head up to the community shelter just to be safe, but it looks like the worst has passed for now." The relief in her voice was evident, but there was no wild celebration, no dramatic display of emotion, just quiet acknowledgement that the danger had passed, followed immediately by the practical work of ensuring everyone made it safely to shelter for the remainder of the night. Selthara stood in the freezing rain, ash drifting gently down around her, watching an entire community respond to what could have easily been a devastating disaster, with nothing more than calm, practiced efficiency. No panic, no despair, simply preparation meeting the moment it was designed for. "You do this often?" she asked quietly, once Sophie had returned to where the visitors stood watching. "More often than I'd like," Sophie admitted, wiping ash from her sleeve. "But less often than you might think, given everything this island throws at us. You learn the patterns eventually. You learn to trust the signs, trust your training, and trust the people standing beside you." Selthara looked out at the glowing ridge in the distance, now beginning to calm as the pressure released harmlessly into the night sky, and then back at the small community gathering quietly around them, already beginning to talk and laugh softly among themselves as the immediate danger passed. She thought of the countless species listed in her ship's archives, each one destroyed by a fraction of the danger this small group of humans had just calmly, efficiently handled without a single life lost. She thought of the protocols her people had built over centuries, protocols designed entirely around avoidance, around retreat, around the fundamental belief that survival meant staying as far from danger as possible. And she thought of Grace's words back in the research station, calm and simple, yet carrying a weight Selthara was only beginning to fully understand. You don't get to control the ground beneath your feet. All you can control is how prepared you are when something happens. As the storm finally began to ease, and the first hints of dawn crept over the horizon, Selthara turned back toward the coastal path, leading up toward the research station, already knowing with absolute certainty that everything she thought she understood about survival was about to be rewritten. By the time the sun rose fully over the island, painting the ash-dusted cliffs in soft shades of orange and gold, Selthara had made her decision. She would not simply file a report and depart. She needed to understand how a species could endure what she had witnessed, not just for one night, but for 200,000 years without pause. Grace offered to help, pulling together records from the station's archive, along with historical accounts passed down from researchers before her. And over the following days, Selthara, Ashen, and Dren began piecing together a picture of humanity's past that left them more astonished with every new discovery. They learned first of the Ice Ages, vast stretches of time when much of the planet's surface had been buried beneath sheets of ice, thick enough to bury mountains. Early humans, according to the fragmented records Grace shared with them, had survived those brutal centuries, not through any biological advantage, but through cooperation, innovation, and a stubborn refusal to simply disappear. They had learned to make fire, to craft tools from bone and stone, to share knowledge across generations, through stories told around flickering flames. Most other species we've studied who faced similarly extreme climate shifts either adapted through slow biological evolution over many thousands of years, or they simply died out, Ashen said, reviewing the data with a growing sense of disbelief. But these early humans adapted through behavior and knowledge, far faster than biology alone could have allowed. Selthara nodded slowly, scrolling through images of ancient cave paintings, delicate and detailed illustrations of animals and hunts passed down through countless generations, a form of communication that had allowed critical survival knowledge to outlive the individuals who first discovered it. They didn't just survive as individuals, she murmured. They survived as a collective memory, passed forward endlessly. The pattern continued throughout human history. Grace told them of great plagues that swept across entire regions, killing enormous portions of the population within just a few short years. Diseases that, according to the historical records, had wiped out nearly a third of certain populations in some periods. And yet, each time, the survivors rebuilt. They developed new understanding of cleanliness, of medicine, of how illness spread from person to person, and slowly, generation by generation, they reduced the danger these plagues once posed. There's also this, Daniel added one evening, joining the conversation with a worn photograph pulled from an old family album kept at the station. It showed a group of explorers standing in front of a makeshift camp, surrounded by nothing but endless white snow and ice, stretching toward a gray horizon. My great-grandfather was part of an expedition to the southern polar region, decades ago. Temperatures out there can drop low enough to freeze exposed skin within minutes. No shelter for hundreds of miles in any direction. They spent months out there, studying the ice, mapping the coastline, simply because no one had done it before. Why would anyone choose to do such a thing? Dren asked, staring at the photograph with genuine confusion. Daniel shrugged, a small, fond smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Curiosity, mostly, and the simple fact that someone has to be first. It's sort of built into us, I think. We don't always wait for things to be safe before we go looking for answers. Over the following days, more stories emerged, each one adding another layer to the picture forming in Selthara's mind. She learned of humans who dove into the crushing darkness of the deepest ocean trenches, places where the pressure alone could crush solid metal, simply to study the strange creatures living in that darkness. She learned of climbers who scaled the tallest, most oxygen-starved peaks on the planet, facing temperatures cold enough to freeze flesh within minutes, driven by nothing more than the desire to stand somewhere few others ever had. She learned, too, of humanity's first tentative steps beyond their own planet entirely, of small crews who had willingly strapped themselves into fragile vessels and launched into the crushing void of space, fully aware of the immense risks involved, simply because the unknown called to them too strongly to ignore. It's the same pattern, every time, Ashen observed, laying out a timeline that stretched across the station's main table, connecting each of the remarkable stories they had gathered. They don't wait for danger to disappear before they act. They study it, prepare for it as best they can, and then they move forward anyway. But why? Dren asked, still struggling to fully grasp the concept. Every other species we've studied prioritizes safety above almost everything else. Why would an entire civilization consistently choose the opposite? It was Grace who answered, having quietly joined the conversation partway through. She leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, considering the question with the same thoughtful seriousness she had shown since their first meeting. I don't think we choose danger for its own sake, she said. I think we've simply learned, over a very long time, that waiting for the world to become safe means waiting forever. This planet was never going to hand us an easy path, so somewhere along the way, we stopped waiting for one, and started building our own instead. Selthara found herself staring out the station's small window, watching the distant ridge where the volcanic vent had calmed back into a quiet, steady wisp of steam, no longer glowing, but still a constant, visible reminder of the danger that lived just beneath the surface of this beautiful, deadly world. She thought of her own people's history, of the careful, cautious expansion the Kryvax Dominion had pursued across the stars for thousands of years, always prioritizing safety, always avoiding unnecessary risk. It had served them well. They had built a vast, stable civilization spanning dozens of star systems, all without suffering the catastrophic losses so many other species had endured. But watching the resilience of the small community around her, hearing story after story of humans who faced overwhelming odds and simply refused to be defeated by them, Selthara couldn't help but wonder what her own people might have achieved had they embraced even a fraction of this same relentless determination. There's one more thing you should see, Ellen said one afternoon, pulling up a final set of records on her monitor. It showed a massive asteroid impact crater, ancient and weathered, evidence of a catastrophic collision that had occurred long before recorded human history began. Evidence suggests an impact event like this wiped out the majority of complex life on this planet at the time, and yet, life recovered, adapted. Eventually, humanity emerged from the aftermath of that very same devastation. "You're saying this planet has already ended the world once before," Selthara said slowly, the weight of the statement settling heavily over her. "More than once, according to the geological record," Ellen confirmed. "Ice ages, mass extinctions, catastrophic climate shifts. This planet has reset itself again and again throughout its history, and every single time, life found a way to continue. Humanity is simply the latest chapter in that same story." Selthara sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing the full scope of what she had learned. It wasn't simply that humans had survived a dangerous planet. It was that they had survived a planet actively hostile to the very concept of permanence, a world that reset itself violently and repeatedly, erasing everything that came before, and still, life persisted. Still, humanity had emerged, and grown, and built cities that stood defiantly against storms and earthquakes and volcanic fire. "I need to see more," Selthara said finally, turning back to face the small group gathered around her. "I need to understand exactly what allowed your species to not just endure this planet, but to build something lasting on top of it." Grace offered a small, knowing smile, one that suggested she had expected this request long before Selthara had voiced it aloud. "Then let us show you," she said. "There's a lot more to see than just this island." The message arrived on the bridge of Selthara's ship late in the evening, cutting through the quiet hum of the engines with an urgency that made her stomach tighten before she had even opened it. The Dominion Council had reviewed her preliminary report, the one she had sent days earlier describing the discovery of Earth and its remarkable inhabitants, and they were demanding her immediate return to deliver a full account in person. "They don't believe it," Dren said, reading over the message beside her. "Look at this line. Requesting verification of sensor accuracy due to statistically improbable findings." Selthara felt a flash of frustration, quickly followed by understanding. She wouldn't have believed it either, not without seeing it with her own eyes. A species surviving on a Class X hostile world for 200,000 years wasn't just improbable by Kryvax standards. It shattered nearly every foundational belief her people held about survival, danger, and the limits of what any civilization could endure. "Prepare a course for the Dominion Council chambers," she said, "and gather every piece of data we've collected, every scan, every recording, every conversation. They're going to need to see all of it." Before departing, Selthara returned one final time to the small research station on the storm-battered island, where Grace and the others had gathered to see them off. The volcanic vent had long since settled back into quiet dormancy, and the storm that had first greeted them upon arrival had given way to a rare, clear evening sky, stars beginning to emerge overhead as the sun dipped below the horizon. "So this is it then," Grace said, standing near the edge of the landing site as the small diplomatic pod prepared for departure. "Back to your people, to convince them we're not as doomed as your instruments seem to think we should be." "Something like that," Selthara admitted, "though I suspect convincing them will be more difficult than convincing myself was." Grace smiled, extending a hand in a gesture Selthara had come to understand as a sign of respect and friendship among humans. Selthara took it carefully, mimicking the gesture as best she could. "For what it's worth," Grace said, "I think whatever you tell them, they should also know we don't consider ourselves anything special for surviving here. This is just home. It's the only one we've ever known, dangerous or not. We didn't have the luxury of choosing somewhere safer." "That," Selthara said quietly, "may be exactly why you succeeded where so many others have failed." The journey back to the Dominion Council chambers took several days, and Selthara spent much of that time preparing her report, organizing the overwhelming amount of data they had gathered into something coherent enough to present before the Council's senior members. She included everything: the initial sensor readings that had first flagged Earth as impossibly hostile, the historical comparisons showing how quickly other species had perished under far gentler conditions, the recordings of the volcanic emergency, showing calm, coordinated human response in the face of genuine danger, and the countless stories of exploration and resilience that Grace and her colleagues had shared, stretching back across thousands of generations of human history. When the ship finally arrived at the Dominion Council chambers, a vast structure orbiting the Kryvax homeworld, Selthara was escorted immediately into the central hall, where a semicircle of senior council members waited, their expressions ranging from skeptical curiosity to open disbelief. Councillor Vashtel, an elder statesman known throughout the Dominion for his cautious, methodical approach to galactic policy, rose first to address her. "Commander Selthara," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber. "Your report describes findings that, frankly, contradict centuries of established survey data. Before we proceed further, we require a full accounting of your evidence." "Of course," Selthara said, stepping forward to the central podium. She activated the display behind her, and immediately, the chamber filled with images of Earth, its swirling storms, its violent volcanic ridges, its cities, standing defiant against every possible danger. "This," she began, "is the planet designated Earth, initially classified as Class X hostile due to extreme environmental instability, radiation exposure, corrosive atmospheric conditions, constant tectonic and volcanic activity, and unpredictable extreme weather patterns that would, by every model in our archives, render long-term habitation impossible." She let the images speak for themselves for a long moment before continuing. "And yet," she said, "the species inhabiting this planet, known as humans, has thrived here for a minimum of 200,000 years, according to available geological and archaeological evidence. Not merely survived, counselors, thrived, built cities, developed advanced technology, reached beyond their own atmosphere into the surrounding void of space." Murmurs spread quietly through the chamber, several council members exchanging skeptical glances. "Explain how this is possible," Councillor Vashtel said. "Every other species we have on record, facing even a fraction of this level of environmental hostility, has either perished or abandoned their settlements within a matter of generations." Selthara nodded, having anticipated this exact question. "I asked myself the same thing, Counselor, from the moment we first detected their signal. What I discovered, through direct observation and extensive conversation with the inhabitants themselves, is that humans do not approach danger the way our own species, or any other species we've encountered, typically does." She pulled up the recording from the volcanic emergency, showing the calm, coordinated evacuation efforts, the practiced efficiency with which the small community had responded to what could have easily become a catastrophic disaster. "They do not wait for the world to become safe before they act," she continued. "They study the danger, they prepare extensively for it, and then they continue living, building, and growing directly alongside it, rather than retreating from it entirely. Where our own survey protocols emphasize avoidance and distance, humans have instead built an entire civilization around preparation and resilience. This seems an unstable foundation for a species to build upon," another council member interjected, a stern woman named Councillor Rethan, who had long overseen the Dominion's survey and expansion policies. "Constant exposure to such extreme danger should, by any reasonable measure, result in significant population loss over time." "It does," Selthara admitted honestly. "Their historical records confirm significant losses throughout their history, from plagues, natural disasters, and other extreme events. And yet, rather than being destroyed by these losses, they seem to adapt and rebuild more effectively after each one. Their knowledge is passed forward across generations with remarkable efficiency, allowing them to continuously refine their understanding of the dangers they face, even as their planet continues to change and threaten them in new ways." She paused, gathering her thoughts before delivering the conclusion she had spent days carefully considering during the long journey back to the council chambers. "I believe," she said slowly, "that our own survival strategies, while effective, have limited our growth in ways we've never fully recognized. We avoid danger so thoroughly that we rarely develop the deep resilience these humans display as a matter of course. They have shown me that survival is not solely about avoiding what threatens you. Sometimes, it is about learning to stand firm beside it, generation after generation, until what once seemed impossible becomes simply another part of daily life." The chamber fell silent for a long moment, the weight of her words settling over the assembled council members. Finally, Councillor Vashtel rose once more, his expression thoughtful rather than skeptical now. "You are proposing we reconsider our entire classification system for hostile worlds," he said. "I am proposing we consider the possibility that resilience, not avoidance, may be the true measure of a species' capacity to survive," Selthara replied. "Earth should not exist, by our current understanding of survivability, and yet it does, filled with a species who greeted strangers from another world with warmth and curiosity, rather than fear, even after enduring hardships that would have ended countless other civilizations." After several hours of deliberation, the Council reached a decision unlike anything in Dominion history. Earth's classification was updated, no longer simply Class X hostile, but Class X thriving, a designation created specifically to acknowledge what had been discovered there. A note was added to the official Dominion archive, one that would remain part of galactic record for centuries to come, describing humanity not as a species that had gotten lucky, but as one that had, against every conceivable odd, learned to make a home out of the very forces that should have destroyed them. Selthara returned to her ship that evening, exhausted but strangely at peace, and set a course back toward the small blue and green planet that had upended everything she thought she understood about survival. She carried with her a small message buoy, one final piece of communication to leave behind for the remarkable species she had come to deeply respect during her time among them. As her ship settled once more into orbit above Earth, she watched the familiar swirl of storms and city lights below, the same violent, beautiful chaos that had first drawn her attention days earlier. She released the buoy carefully, watching it drift gently down toward the planet's surface, carrying with it a message she hoped would one day reach the people who had so unknowingly changed her understanding of what it truly meant to survive. The message was simple, recorded in her own voice, translated as best her systems allowed, into the language Grace and the others had so patiently taught her. "You were never meant to survive this world. By every measure we have ever recorded, this planet should have destroyed you many times over. And yet, you did more than simply survive. You built lives here. You built homes, and families, and futures, standing directly in the path of every danger this world could offer. You did not conquer this planet. You made peace with it, and in doing so, you made it truly your own." As her ship turned slowly away, beginning the long journey back toward Kryvax space, Selthara allowed herself one final look at the small blue world fading behind her, its storms still raging, its volcanoes still smoldering, its cities still standing bright and defiant against the darkness of space. Somewhere down there, she knew, Grace and the others were likely already back at work, monitoring the ridge, tracking the tides, preparing quietly for whatever the next storm might bring. Not because they had been promised safety, not because the danger had ever truly passed, but because that was simply what it meant to call Earth home. And as far as Selthara was concerned, after everything she had witnessed, there was no greater measure of strength than that.